Here we are for our CEPR Political Economy webinar series that meets once a month, namely the first Wednesday of every month at 3 p.m. UK time. And today we have Paola Giuliano from UCLA, who very kindly woke up early. It's 7 p.m. over there. Next month we'll have our last of the series before the summer. So that's the Wednesday, June 2nd, with Francesco Trebbi from Berkeley. And then we'll probably take a break for the summer and resume after, when the new semester starts in the fall. And so maybe we can slowly get started. So today is the 5th of May in Europe, and here we are, especially in France, commemorating the 200 years since the death of Napoleon. And whereas across the ocean, especially in California, where Paola is the Cinco de Mayo, where they're commemorating the victory against Napoleon, but Napoleon III of the Mexicans. And Paola is going to talk about, in fact, transmission across the ocean of cultural and political values historically from Europe to the United States in this very nice way. Paola, the floor is yours. Let me remind you of the rules. Please be very active on the chat. I'll read the chat and transmit the main questions during the first 60 minutes that Paola has to give her talk, and then we'll be opening the floor to questions from the audience, which for 15 minutes can be asked directly to Paola. Thank you very much, Paola, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the nice introductions, and then thank you to Elius and all the organizers. See, this is joint work with Marco Tabellini. So there is probably a little need to motivate the papers. Immigration is today one of the most salient political issues, and has been also in the past. Is a large field in economics, so I won't review the literature on the impact of immigrations on labor market or on education. So this is a paper looking at the impact of one specific period of American history, which is the age of mass migrations, on political attitude in the US. There are already few papers on the relevance on immigrants on political outcomes, but most of this paper, they look at the short-term effect. So Alesina and co-authors wrote a paper on the impact of immigrants in Europe on preferences for redistributions. And there are several papers on the impact of immigrants on political ideology, both in the US and across Europe. As if I have to summarize, the result, most of them do find that the presence of immigrants, it's correlated negatively with preferences for redistributions. And I will review quickly also the theoretical literature. And when you look at political ideology, most of the time, immigrants are correlated to a shift towards a right-leaning movement. Although, for example, in the paper of Maida and co-authors, it depends on the type of skills with which immigrants arrive. What we do in this paper, we look at the long-term effect. So how immigrants how the effect of immigrants can vary between the short-term and the long-term effect. There are various reasons why the long-term effect can be different. One is related to the contact hypothesis. So this is a famous hypothesis in sociology, claiming that maybe initially you have a backlash when a new group arrives, but then you start to know them, the immigrants in this case, and then your preferences can shift over time. Immigrants tend to assimilate, of course, to various degrees. And so what we try to show or to claim in this paper is that most of the time when we think about assimilations, we look at the assimilations of immigrants to the culture, the ideology of the majority, but this can spill over, can go the other way around. So what we will try to claim in this paper that the massive arrival of Europeans had an effect on the ideology of people in the US. So let me give you a broad overview of the period that we are interested in. So this chart represents the fraction of immigrants as the percentage of the US populations over time. This paper is about the arrival during the period of mass migrations, roughly speaking, between 1815 and 1910. Then there started to be a decline, and then we will use this decline as an exogenous shock for our instrument, and the decline started with the quota in World War I. But the arrival of immigrants was massive, so during this period of time was around 40% of the US populations. So this is a broad overview of what this paper does. So we look at the long run effect of the period of mass migrations. I will give you some evidence towards the end of the talk of the evolutions of ideology in the US over time, trying to bridge the past to the present. But most of the analysis will look at ideology today. So we will use data from the congressional election studies. So he has the advantage, this survey, of having data on preferences for redistributions, political ideology, and political behavior. And important for us, he has the county identifier, so we can look at the behavior of US-born student individuals when in a county where European immigrants settled. And then we will, we have a version of the instrument, although in our case, and I can speculate on the reasons, the OLS and the two-stage least square essentially gives the same result. These are the main findings, and what we find is that the historical presence of immigrants move ideology to the left and makes individual more preferences for redistribution. So this is, when we start working on this paper, we thought that we were going to find exactly the opposite effect. So I was fairly certain that the presence of immigrants, consistent with all the literature on preferences for redistribution, would have shifted the preferences for redistributions of people in the US, making them less pro-redistributions and making them more right-leaning. And so then, we had this very surprising result, which is contrary to the theoretical literature and contrary to the short-run effect. So we were trying to understand what could be the reasons for these positive correlations. Of course, the first things that we did, and I will show you all the exercises that we did in the paper. We try to rule out all possible economic channels, both related to the places where the immigrants settle, but also related to the specific characteristic of the immigrants. And then what we speculate is that there was a transmission of cultures from immigrants to people in the US. And our idea is that those immigrants arrived with more exposure to the welfare state. Compared to people in the US, they were exposed to education reform, some pension reform, depending on the countries. And so it was a story of horizontal transmissions. And then, to try to see whether this interpretation is plausible, we did find that to investigate the transmissions when there was more intermarriage and more residential integrations and more linguistic similarity. And we do find that when intermarriage was more prevalent, when residential integration was more common, and when linguistic similarity between people from the US and different parts of Europe was higher, the results were stronger. We then have one part, unfortunately, is more speculative because there are no individual level data on preferences for redistributions for the past. But we look at the vote for the Democratic Party over time, and we did find that this presence of immigrants started in 1928. There is a wonderful book by Christine Anderson in which she essentially claims that the realignment of political ideology in the US was partial, was in big part, so she cannot prove it because she doesn't have individual level data, but was in big part the result of the mobilizations of immigrants, especially in the elections of 1928, when Al Smith was of immigrants' origin and was one of the presidential candidates. So let me go quickly on the literature. So broadly speaking, this paper is related to the literature on preferences for redistribution. There is a famous book by Alesina and Glaser, several papers by Alesina, most recently the one on Europe. I've written a review paper with Alberto about 10 years ago. And important for this specific paper is a paper by Lutmer and Singal, because they did find that immigrants, there is a strong vertical transmissions of preferences for redistribution among immigrants. So, you know, for us, it's important to have both the vertical transmission, so immigrants needs to bring with them their preferences for redistributions, but then in addition, we try to show that they transmit these values to people from the US. For the period of mass migrations, there are several papers. Many of them has been written by Abramiskin and co-authors on various aspects of social mobility, of assimilations of immigrants during this historical period. There is less on the long-term effect of European mass migrations. One is a recently published paper by CEPR and co-authors. So they look at the historical presence of immigrants in the US and their economic impact. And it's interesting because, again, they did find that they have a positive effect, which should reduce preferences for redistribution. And Sebastian Ottinger, which was one of our students on the market this year, he looked at the presence of immigrants and how they were important for the industrializations of the US. Again, these are important channel to understand even the political transmission. So this is a broad roadmap of the talk. So we'll start with the historical background, describe the empirical strategy and the main result. You know, of course, this is a paper that covers, you know, many years of American history. So I will speculate on the mechanism. So I think we can rule out, at least based on all the data that we have, that the results are not driven by economic channels. And then we will try to claim that is one specific aspect of cultural transmissions of immigrants transmitting their preferences for the welfare states to people from the US. And then I will give you some data looking at the period of some redistribution program during the New Deal, and also the evolutions of the share of the Democratic Party in the US from 1900 to today. So a few things on the historical background. Probably you are already familiar with this part of the of American history, but until 1915, European immigrations was essentially unrestricted. There was a huge number of Europeans arriving in the US, more than 30 million, and the historical period was roughly between 1850 and 1915. The compositions was different over time, and so this gives us also some interesting historical variation. So if you look at the period between 1850 and 1890, most of the immigrants were coming from Germany, UK, Ireland, and the Nordic countries. And then in the second period, they come from partially from Southern Europe, many people from Sicily, the place where I'm from, also Northern Europe, and then Eastern Europe and Russia. So this is a different chart. So before I show you the fraction of immigrants in terms of the US population, this is just the raw number. As you see, there is a big spike, especially after 1890, and then a huge decline related to World War I, and then the quotas. One more descriptive chart, if you want to have a sense of how big the relative groups were in terms of size. At the beginning of the period, most of the immigrants were from North and Western Europe, then the Southern and Eastern Europe arrived. You know, if you wonder about the presence of the other countries, it was fairly small compared to the European mass migration. So our source of variations will be just, you know, Europeans. So about the, the main intuitions of the paper, again, this was a very surprising result. So I think it's novel because to our knowledge is the first one documenting a positive associations between a measure of diversity, if you want, and preferences for redistribution. So if you look at the literature on preferences for redistributions, the book by Alesine and Glaser will tell you that the correlation should go the other way around. The idea being that in average, people do not like to redistribute if they are surrounded by people different than them. In their book, they mostly refer to racial diversity. So there could be this aspect, but, immigrants are also different along many other dimensions. So the prediction should be a negative correlation. There is a fascinating book by Lipset and Marx. So it didn't happen here. And so they try to explain why socialism was never a prevalent ideology in the US. And their idea is that, well, the US is a country of immigrants, and so it's very hard for them to form an identity based on working class. So, if you take immigrants, they will feel much more like Italians or Irish, and so this will be their prevalent identity. And so their claim is that is the melting pot that didn't allow the Socialist Party to become an important party in the US. And they have some correlation in which they show for some specific state that, for example, the presence of Germans was related to the presence of higher vote for socialism in the 1920 and 1930, but they don't do anything systematically. If you look at the seminal model on preferences for redistribution, the one by Meltzer and Richard, one of the main results is that a higher level of income should be related to lower preferences for redistribution. And again, if I put together the theoretical intuitions with the result of the paper by CEPR and co-authors, the empirical paper find that the presence of immigrants was related to a higher level of county GDP today. So again, the result should have gone against our finding. The other concern could be, well, maybe the immigrants were selected in a specific way or they had specific economic characteristics. So we control for all the characteristics. I will give you the detail in a second. In terms of selections based on cultural values, unfortunately, we don't have data on values for the distant past. But in average, in the literature, it has been found that more individualistic people are more likely to migrate. And so there should be, again, a negative correlations with preferences for redistribution. More successful migrants, they're more likely to stay. Again, the literature on social mobility will tell you that if I'm poor today and I make it to the, and become rich in the future, I am less likely to redistribute or want to redistribution. And then if we believe that people who move in the US because of the American dream, they should believe more in the importance of effort. And again, the correlation should go the other way around. So our story is that immigrants probably moved the ideology of people from the US to the left. They were probably more left-leaning compared to Americans at that time. And then, if you look at this specific period of American history, it was, the frontier culture was probably very prevalent. And so we also test for that. So we got the data from Sam Bazzi and co-authors, so we can even include controls for the presence of the frontier, which is a proxy for rugged individualism. So our story is, if we look at these immigrants compared to the US, they were more exposed to welfare reform. There were different types of reforms. So I will start with the broad descriptions of Germans arriving in the US before and after Bismarck. Then we will look at public education is the one that was implemented mostly before immigrants arrived to the US. Pension and welfare reforms, Bismarck is an important one. It was in 1884. There were other type of reforms like labor market reform, but we include in some of the robustness, but they were mostly implemented after the period in which we're interested in. So our story is a story of transmissions of European more left-leaning ideologies to the ideology of people from the US. So what are the data that we use? So we use US Census of Populations from 1900 to 1930. So we calculate the share of immigrants, all the demographic characteristics of immigrants, and all the county economic characteristics. Again, I will give you details on which specific variables are included in each regressions. For the left-hand side, we have the cooperative congressional election studies. So it started in 2006. It's much larger in terms of size than the General Social Survey, which is a survey that is normally used in this literature. And it contains information on political ideology and preferences for redistribution. So these are fairly standard in literature. So let me give you some more descriptions of where immigrants went in the period of the mass migrations. So this is a map of the US representing the historical fractions of European immigrants for the period of our analysis. So we use 1910, 1930 because it's important for the instrument, but the results do not change if you use the overall period from 1850 to 1930. So a darker color here indicates a larger presence of immigrants. Again, the darker area is from 11% to 40%, so it was massive. And there was a big cluster. There were a few immigrants in the South, so in many of the regressions we just exclude the South. A lot of them were in the northern part of the countries and of course the coast. Now, all our regression include state fixed effect. So this is practically the variations that we are going to be using in our regression.
I'm sorry, Paola, just to announce, I heard that the chat was disabled at first, so it is enabled again. So please give your comments and I will ask Paola, or just put comments in there that'll be useful for Paola to look at after the talk or later during the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Elias. Yeah. Okay, so these are the questions that you can find in the CCS. So 4 on political ideology, 1 is an indicator of whether the person is conservative versus liberal, going from 1 to 5. So all our questions are coded so that a higher number means a more left-leaning ideology. So there is a measure of from 1 to 7 of party affiliations, Republicans to Democrat, a 0-1 measure of whether the person belongs to the Democratic Party, and then actual voting behavior, meaning if the person voted for the Democratic president in the previous elections. 4 questions on preferences for redistributions, whether the person opposed spending cut, he or she is in support of welfare spending, whether the person supports an increase in the minimum wage, and whether he or she believes that the deficit should be financed with taxes that we recorded from 0 to 100. So this is the main estimating equation. On the left-hand side, you have ideology or preferences for redistribution for a given individual. So individual here is a person who is American, meaning born and raised in the US. So there are no immigrants in our regressions. This person lives in a given county C belonging to a given state. And then there are survey years. So the survey is yearly from 2006 to today. So there are state fixed effect, survey fixed effect. I will give you details on the controls. But our coefficient of interest is for the variable which indicates the fraction of immigrants in the period between 1910 and 1930 in a given county. Okay, we then have a series of rich set of individual controls and a rich set of historical controls. So let me tell you the historical controls. So they are all calculated before the immigrants arrived. So in 1900, we have the black and the urban share. So these are the baseline. So then in the robustness check, I will tell you a few more controls that we had, like a measure of inequality, for example. Additional controls are labor force participations employment share in manufacturing is important for the determinations of ideology. In this period, you don't have measure of income, but there are data on occupation, so it's fairly common to calculate an occupational income score. And then we have railroad connectivity and geographical coordinate. So for the individual controls, so these are the ones that are included in the regressions, and then let me tell you which could be good or bad controls, but we always have a quadratic in age, gender, race dummies, marital and employment status, educational attainment, and income dummies. So the controls comes from the fact that there are standard controls in the literature on preferences for redistribution. Of course, some of them can be endogenous. So in the appendix, we have various specifications, meaning that very parsimonious, like with just quadratic in age, gender, and race, and then even very parsimonious on the historical controls, but the results are fairly robust. As an instrument, so in this literature, there are two types of instruments that you can use. We try them both, but the main paper use an instrument that is sort of, it's not time varying, but is a shift share instrument in the following sense. So I use the following intuition. So it's based on card. So historically, immigrants settled in different counties. But then there is time series variations that should be exogenous to the country locations of immigrants. And so these time series variations comes from essentially two shocks. One is World War I, and the other one is the Immigration Act that restrict the presence of immigrants. So this is one way in which, so this is for Marco Tabellini's job market paper was about the age of mass migration. So this was his main instrument. The other instrument is the one that CEPR and co-author have used, meaning that instead of looking at the period between 1910 and 1930, so we start for this period because before we don't have sufficient variations for all the group. You can use the overall period from 1850 to 1930, and instead of using the shift share instrument, you can instrument with weather variations and then railroad connectivity. We also tried that instrument. The results are similar for the second stage. There is more difference between the two-stage least square and the OLS. It's less relevant for us because we want to capture the exposure to the welfare states. So this instrument is more useful for us because, it captures the variations that we are interested in. But, if you have concern, instrumental variable for this literature are never optimal. Then you can also see in the paper the other type of instrumental variable. So this is how the instrument is constructed. So essentially, alpha is the share of immigrants arriving from a given country and living in County C in 1900. Then we take the variations of immigrants between period T-1 and period T. And so let's say Italians arriving in the US from 1900 to 1910, but then for each county, we take out the Italians that that settle in the specific county. So it is a live-out version of the instrument. And then everything is normalized by the population in 1900. So the instrument, the first stage is essentially one. So there is no variations between the OLS and the two-stage least square. And again, the identifying assumptions is related to the fact that the migrations pattern from 1900 to 1930 were shocked in an exogenous way by World War I and the immigrations one, and then the county-specific factor should be also uncorrelated with the evolutions of ideology over time. So you can have various concerns with the instrument. So we did a variety of things. One is we can control for immigrations from 1850 to 1900. If you wonder that immigrants decided to settle in places that were much more liberal to start with, we control for the democratic vote share in 1900. We control for the 1900 immigrant share one at a time. We use the weather shock and consider immigrants from 1850 to 1930. Another concern would be Well, maybe the places where immigrants went were places where there was a lot of migration, including internal migrations. And so these places where many people were going, not only immigrants, but also people from other states in the US, were more liberal or were special to start with. And so we control for internal migrations and also control for the great migrations of Blacks from the south to the north.
Sorry, Paola. So there's a nice question by Ethan Kaplan, which I encourage for the later discussion because it's a long question. But there's a clarifying questions by Okunsak asking if the individuals in the samples, could they be children of previous immigrants?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So I will have one slide in which we use the GSS. So one story would be that, so we cannot say in the sense that in the CCS, there is no, I mean, I know if people are born, but I cannot identify the children of immigrants. And so this could be of, this could be people with Italian ancestry, but in the GSS, we can do these controls because an alternative story is not about horizontal transmissions, could be a mix of vertical transmissions and persistence of enclaves over time. So I think if Ethan, I mean, if I can predict Ethan questions, the story could be, well, there were a lot of people from Sweden settling in Minnesota. The preferences for redistributions are transmitted vertically over time. There, if a person from Sweden has to move in the US, he will probably continue to choose Minnesota. So it's a couple of persistence of ethnic enclaves and vertical transmissions. So we try to rule out, so I will show the result with the GSS. This is the main table on ideology. This is the two-stage least square, and again with the OLS are almost identical. And we consistently find, again, contrary to our finding, I know that in economics there is a lot of emphasis on the mechanism and so on, but if I had to summarize my paper, this is the surprising result. I would have bet all the money that I had that the correlation would have been negative, and then it's surprising because again, it goes against the literature. So you find these positive correlations. So let me just give you a sense of the magnitude. So if you look at 5 percentage point increase in immigrations, it's related to 6 percentage increase in the democratic identifications. The results are a little bit smaller for support for welfare spending. So all the other questions have a similar magnitude, but they are large if you look at the overall literature on preferences for redistribution. So for example, the literature on preferences for redistribution emphasize the importance of income. So a 5 percentage point increase in immigrants' share implies an increase in preferences for redistribution. Again, if you become poorer, you are more pro-preferences for redistributions. So the shift will be of an income between 100K and 10K in the survey. Being Black is one of the most important predictors of preferences for redistribution in the US. So immigrants count for 40% the effect of race. So the question is why the result goes in the opposite direction. So the first things that we have to rule out are the economic mechanism. And then we try to show that it could be related to horizontal transmission. Since I have only 25 minutes left, in addition to the robustness that I show you, there are a series of robustness. The paper is overly long, especially the appendix, but you can find all the details in the paper. And if in the discussions you have some specific concern on some specific omitted variables, I'm happy to discuss those. So on the economic channel, so the first channel is income. And again, the only paper that look at the long-term effect of immigrants on economic development is the paper by CEPR and co-authors. They did find that there is a higher level of income related to the historical presence of immigrants. And in general, even lower level of unemployment today, higher level of human capital, and so on. So again, the correlations could go in the opposite, should go in the opposite directions. It could be some immigrants' characteristics. Again, we cannot control for the ideology in the past. So the only measure of ideology is my exposure to the welfare states, but we can control for a series of economic characteristics that could be related to preferences for redistribution. So from the census, you can get data on literacy, you can get data on skills and occupations, you can get data on the ability of speaking English, and then you can construct, we use the data by Abramiski and Cote, or you can construct measure of intergenerational mobility. Again, for the type of beliefs that they had at the time, we don't have any information. So we don't have any information on individualism or the personal ideology. Again, the correlations intuitively should go against our finding. Another concern that you may have is, well, maybe the immigrants decided to leave because of the welfare reform. But again, if I don't like a higher level of taxations and I decided to move to the US, probably my level of preferences for redistribution should be lower compared to people who stayed in the country. So this would be my speculations. So the only thing that we can do, we can control for a measure of the American frontiers. And so this is the prevalent individualism of a specific place in the US. So our story is that the immigrants brought their preferences with them, and then they transmit these preferences over time to natives. So here, native means, remember, US born individuals. So I will start, again, is descriptive, but I will start with the example of the Germans. So we split the Germans who arrived before and after the Bismarck reform in 1884. And then we do a more general exercise. So essentially what we do is we look at the year in which a specific countries introduce various measures of welfare reform, and then we calculate the year of exposure before the specific immigrants arrive to the US, and then we aggregate at the country level. So we'll have an average exposure for Italians, an average exposure for Sweden, and so on. And then we construct a measure of exposure to welfare reform, and then we control for all the other immigrants' characteristics. Now, one question that you may have is, well, take, for example, the reform introducing compulsory educations. We interpret it as a measure of preferences for the welfare states, but it could be not related, it could be related to human capital, so it could be not related at all to preferences for redistribution. So we do a sort of validations of our measure of welfare reform, which is the following. We take data from the European Social Survey. We look at immigrants. So these are immigrants going to different European countries today. We know their individual level preferences for redistributions, and we see if their preferences for redistributions are stronger when the exposure of welfare reform was higher. Okay, so this exercise has been performed by Lutmer in a different way. So Lutmer looked at, let's say, Italian going to Turkey, measure the preferences for redistribution, and see that these preferences for redistributions are correlated with the preferences for redistributions of Italians. What we do, instead of looking at the preferences for redistribution of Italians, we look at the exposure to welfare reform. So it is a way of validating our measure from the past. So let me start with the Germans. So this is, again, because people have in mind, this was one of the most important, if not the first also, welfare reform. It was the Bismarck reform. So we split Germans between Germans arriving in the US before and after, and we did find that only the German arriving after the Bismarck reform have an effect. Again, we can control for all the economic characteristics. They don't seem to be very different of the Germans arriving before and after. We don't have data on their individual beliefs. Again, but this is just, as a motivation. We did this for ideology, and we did this for preferences for redistributions, and then the results go in the same direction. These are the welfare reforms, the data that we use. So these are different type, the data come from a book from Flora. So they have, he collected data on education, pension, reform. So these are the ancient one. Then you have also data on injuries, health and unemployment. And so we construct an index collecting all of them, and then an index focusing more on education and pension because the coverage is better and the period of exposure is higher. So let me give you a map because visually can help. So before I show you a map of the presence of immigrants, this is a exposure to the social welfare reform. And again, a darker color means that the exposure was higher. Of course, when you have people from the Nordic countries, then you see a darker color. So you can do a variety of exercises with the exposure to welfare reform. First, you can include it in the same regressions, and so and then you did find that unlike all the other characteristics, the exposure to welfare reforms is he has a high beta coefficient and is positively related. And you can do it for the exposure to, you can do it for preferences for redistributions, but also for ideology. But probably the most meaningful exercise is if you split the sample. So you split the sample between exposure above the median and exposure below the median, and we did find that you find a much higher coefficient when the exposure to the welfare reform was larger. Another exercise that we run is
they're asking from the
yes.
chat here if this could be some technical thing that's driving this, and it's just that there was higher fiscal capacities from the 30s on, and so that could have driven all your effects. Just this higher fiscal capacity later on.
Okay, so let me speculate. So we did some robustness with some other measure of political attitude in the country of origin. And so, it could be that the fiscal capacity determined the preferences in the country of origin, but then we don't observe, so the fiscal capacity cannot be translated to the US. But I'm happy to, to discuss this specific point at the end when I tell you which other characteristics we include to try to pin down these preferences for redistributions. And I have a few more slides on the preferences for redistribution. So I think if whoever asked that questions, please feel free to come back at the end. Another exercise that you can do is to split the sample in two. So our stories is not only being Europeans that matter, but being Europeans that were treated with this welfare reform. And so we put them all together, and we did find that is the historical fraction of immigrants between 1910 and 1930 that matters. Again, when you split the sample with immigrants arriving before 1900 and after, then the result seems to be driven mostly from immigrants that were exposed to the welfare reform. So, is this measure a good proxy of welfare reform? It could be a proxy of fiscal capacity. So we try to see if even today it's related to beliefs. So what we do is we take the European Social Survey. So he has data on immigrants on 23 different countries. There is one question that has been used in the paper by Lutmer and Singal on preferences for redistribution, which is the government should reduce differences in income level. And so what Lutmer again did is it looks at how Italians respond when they are in some other countries that is different than Italy. And they observe in their paper that this is correlated to the beliefs in the country of origin. What we do is we run regressions on individual level preferences for redistributions, controlling for some country characteristics and individual controls on the year of the introductions of the reform. So again, here the correlation should be negative because if the year of the introduction is later on in time, it means that the exposure is lower. And so we did find that there is a negative correlations with preferences for redistribution. So then Another way of controlling is, instead of using the exposure to welfare reform, you can control this measure of preferences for you can use this measure of preferences for redistribution in the country of origin. Again, assuming that this, the transmission has been very slow over time. So then, we find this positive correlation with the exposure to welfare reform. Then we need one more piece, which is where the immigrants were able to influence the ideology of people from the US. And so if you believe that there is some truth in the contact hypothesis, the prediction would be that, when immigrants have a stronger contact with people from the US, then the result should be stronger. Of course, the probability of intermarrying between the two groups is also endogenous. So for all these regressions, we look, for example, at intermarriage in 1900, but we have some exercises on heterogeneity. So we do 3 exercises on heterogeneity. So one is intermarriage, the other one is residential integrations, and the third one is linguistic similarity. So linguistic similarity could proxy for 2 things. One is just diffusions of informations. If they speak a similar language, they're more likely to communicate. Linguistic similarity in the literature has been considered also a proxy for cultural similarity and trust. And so we could proxy for both. So this is what we find. We find that the results are stronger when immigrants were more likely to intermarry with people from the US at the beginning of the period. We find that the results are stronger when immigrants were more residentially integrated. And we did find that the results are stronger when they were linguistically close. So here should be a linguistic similarity. So darker color means linguistically close or linguistically distant. So in the remaining time, let me do a few things. One is, I think, Ethan's question, which is, could still be related to vertical transmissions. So the other story that you may have in mind is the following. Suppose that ethnic settlements are sticky. So, Italians tend to continue to go mostly to New York City, and people from Sweden go to Minnesota. And we know that there is a strong vertical transmissions. All our result could be a combination of the stickiness of ethnic settlement coupled with vertical transmissions. So what we do, we use data from the General Social Survey. So this is a survey that has been used a lot on preferences for redistribution. We don't use it as our main survey for 2 reasons. One is that the sample size at the county level is much smaller. The other reasons is that if you ever do a plot, so if you buy the restricted version of the General Social Survey, you will realize that it's very biased in the sense that instead of having the overall counties for the US, they just sample the rich counties. So they sample mostly urban counties. So they have roughly 300 counties compared to more than 2,000 in the CCS. So with that caveat in mind, the General Social Survey has several advantages for us. One is it asks questions of the ancestry of the respondents. So I can control for being of Italian ancestry and so on. But it also reports the nativity of parents and grandparents. So I can restrict at least to people who were born in the US, whose parents were born in the US, and then grandparents were born in the US, and then I can control for dummies for all the European countries. And so there are several reassuring things. First is, the questions are very similar. So we have 3 questions on political ideology, 3 questions on preferences for redistribution. So again, these are fairly standard in literature. We first run the regressions very similar to the CCES, but with any US born, okay? And so we did find that, again, including similar set of controls, there is a positive correlations between immigrants' share and preferences for redistributions and political ideology. Then we run the regressions on 2 subsets. One is US born with native parents, and then US born with native grandparents. You find the still positive correlations. The results, and the sample becomes much smaller, and then in all the regressions we can include ancestry fixed effect, and then you still find this positive correlation, which we don't rule out the possibility that there is vertical transmissions, but we think that our result, horizontal transmission could probably play a role. So let me give you, in the remaining 10 minutes, few more slides trying to link the past to the present. In all these papers that look at this long persistence over a period of time, unfortunately, for data limitations, in all of this paper, you see an outcome today related with one outcome in the past. So ideally, I would like to track the evolutions of generations over time, but there are no individual level data on voting behavior for the past or even preferences for redistributions. And so I will tell you what we did with the data that are available.
There's a question, Paola. Can you rule out that these results are driven by changes in the ideology of the Republicans and the Democrats in the US?
So most of the change in ideology in the Republicans and the Democrats was in the South. So there is the paper by Kudzienko and co-authors. So we did run the same specifications by excluding the South, and so we don't think that the shift is related to the change in ideology between the party. Yeah. So this is a fascinating chart, if you want. So let me tell you how the regressions has been run. So we run separate regressions for each year, okay? So we have the democratic vote share in 1900, we correlated with historical immigrations and all the controls, and then we do it for each election year. What you see is that there is no effect. Then there is this huge effect in 1928, and then the result essentially stays fairly stable over time, with some variation, but always as a positive coefficient. So why 1928 was an important election? So there is a wonderful book by Christine Anderson. So there is a lot of discussions in political science on the realignment of the Democratic, from the Republican to the Democratic Party. It mostly happened during this period of time. And then her story is the following, where this realignment was mostly driven by mobilizations of immigrants. So Hal Smith was of Irish descent, and then he was responsible for bringing the children of EU immigrations into participating into politics, and most importantly into voting for the Democratic Party. The book is interesting because it's an historical reconstruction. Of course, she cannot split, she didn't have, there are no individual level data on voting, but the Democratic Party during this period of time started to become more welfare oriented. And so this is our story. So there is this massive arrival of people. Then there was a strong mobilizations in a period of time. So, we can speculate on the external validity of our paper if you want at the end. And then this changed the ideology. And then there was this horizontal transmission that made the ideology in these specific counties consistently more left-leaning. The other piece of information that we do have for this period of time are some measure of New Deal programs. They are divided in relief expenditure, public work, farm progress, and housing loans. So the literature says that the most redistributive program was the relief expenditure, and it was most redistributive because it went to counties where where the level of unemployment was especially hard, was especially high. Farm program was and public work were less redistributive in nature because, for example, the farm programs went to counties where there could be large farms, and so it could be, you know, the level of income was essentially higher if you compare it to the redistribution coming from relief expenditure. But we did find that, you know, if you rank this program in terms of redistributive nature, the presence of the effect of the presence of immigrants was higher in terms of magnitude. So this is the beta coefficients when the redistributive nature was higher. So I have 4 minutes. Let me conclude and maybe say a few things about all the other characteristics from the country of origin. So this paper is a paper that looks at the long-term effect of historical immigrations in the US on political ideology and preferences for redistribution. Again, the result was surprising because the literature typically tells you that any form of diversity should be related to lower preferences for redistributions. And this is what all the papers that have been looking at the short-run effect of immigrations find. So the literature has found that when there are more immigrants, preferences for redistributions tends to be lower, and then people tend to be more inclined to vote for right-leaning parties. Again, some paper emphasize also that the skill with which the immigrants arrive also matters. What we find in this paper is instead that immigrants move the ideology of people from the US to the left, and they make US born more left-leaning. And our story is a story of horizontal transmissions. And so, you know, they, when in those cases in which contact between US born and immigrants was higher, for example, when they were intermarrying more, where they were more residentially integrated, where the linguistic similarity was higher, we do find that the results are stronger. We try to rule out vertical transmissions. You know, most of my paper are on vertical transmissions. It's just that I think it's very important, and there is evidence that vertical transmissions is relevant even for preferences for redistributions in the US and Europe, but we think that is not enough to explain the movement to the left. And so we think that horizontal transmission is important. Of course, we don't have random assignment of immigrants, so we try to rule out any sort of omitted variables in the best possible way. I think is an important contributions for 2 other reasons. One is it's important to think, you know, the effect on immigrations can be very different if you look at the short-term versus the long-term effect. And so maybe, you know, from now on, we will have better data, or we will be able to link individual over time. And so, you know, the contact hypothesis can take, you know, a few years or maybe centuries sometimes. And the other important point is that usually when we think about assimilations, at least in economics, we tend to look at the assimilations of immigrants to the ideology or the culture or the labor market outcomes of the majority, but the assimilations is not a one-sided process. So it can go the other way around, meaning that if you have a massive arrivals of immigrants, they can also have an impact on, you know, ideology in our case, but you have a lot of anecdotal evidence on, I don't know, cinema or cuisine or many cultural attributes. Okay, I think it's 7:59. So with that, I've done, and then I'm happy to answer any remaining questions that you have.
Thank you very much, Paola. We'll open the floor. There were several questions on the chat that I didn't have time to convey to you directly. Maybe people want to just ask them directly. Please, Tom, go ahead.
Yes, hi. Sorry, my camera's not working, so I'll have to do just audio.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you thought that in addition to the factors you mentioned, that the dynamics of immigrant enfranchisement also played a role in assimilating immigrants into the community. That is, that there's a kind of interaction between not just the personal associations of people, but the extent to which immigrants are seen as a legitimate member of the political community, which is reflected in the rate at which they're enfranchised within the community.
Yeah, we believe that this is an important, it could be an important part to explain we didn't find a good way of measuring it because in the sense that so if they start to participate, they can choose different political representatives. They probably change the institutions of the countries in which their participation was higher. So we have been thinking on how we can measure it, but we believe that it could be an important channel, at least to explain the size of the effects. Yeah.
Well, I also think of it as a way of linking the short run to the long run.
Long run, yeah.
Enfranchisement is a process that depends on lots of other things happening over time, and it almost never enfranchisement never happens. People don't become citizens.
Right. Yeah.
For a long time.
Anyway. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Please lift your hand up so we can have a pecking order. Katya has a question.
Hi, Paola. Thank you very much. It's really exciting work. So I wonder about one thing, whether there is any data on the actual, dynamics of the preference for redistribution in the European, in the source countries of these immigrants. So I understand that you are using the reforms, but presumably these reforms didn't come from the blue. They probably preceded with some change in attitude. That's one thing. The other thing I noticed in the slide where you show different reforms which you use, for example, for Russia, there is 1918 and 1922 reforms, which are the revolution. And for a fact, it is clear that as far as immigrants from Russia, these are the guys who flee the revolution and definitely didn't share any preferences for redistribution, which were, advocated by the reformers at the time. So that means that there must have been some selection there. I know that the Russian revolution case is very special, and for the Germans, surely I buy your story, but I'm still curious, when the Germans developed this this preference to be able to time it better? Thanks.
So I think that's a point that you have been trying to tackle in a variety of ways. We didn't find good data on some variations of preferences for redistribution from the country of origin. So we tried a variety of sources. We were not even able to find data on how much they did vote for the Socialist Party, which I thought that it would be present somewhere, but we are still looking, and we were not able, unfortunately, to find this measure. The selection is an issue. Our intuition is, if this, one thing that we haven't done yet, but we are planning to do, because it will take us a few minutes and it can help. So at the moment, we do a horse race between immigrants arriving before and after, right? But if your point is valid, the story would be, well, if the Germans introduce a reform in their country of origin, they should already been inclined. And so even the one who arrived in the US, they were pro-redistribution, but not treated. So one thing that is cheap to do is just look at the pre-period. So don't do the horse race. And so maybe, it would be an interesting way, because I can distinguish between the experience of the reform and, let's say, that some ideology that made, people change their country in the country of origin. Now, the issue that we are with it, that I will have with that exercise is, if I don't find any effect, so the selection in some sense will go the other way around. So if the Russians who arrive in the US were not pro-redistributions, and I need to have a story on why they were not pro-redistributions, but they had some characteristics that moved people of the US to the left. So maybe a very simple story is that no matter what, the US in the period of time with the RAG individualism was the most right-wing countries, and so whatever was arriving was moved. So it was all reversion to the mean. So this could be another story, but I think the reasons why we did the German is, it's one country. There is one time. I can look at the before and after. Even for the German, and people complain because I can put all the characteristics, but then, I think recently in one seminar, people told me, oh, but the one, can you look at the religion? Maybe with the last name, you can try to see if there are other cultural differences between the two groups. But yeah, if something, I think the selections would go the other way around. Yeah, the other thing that we were able to do with other, and there was a question on fiscal capacity or in general other political country characteristics. In the appendix, we included things like the level of democracy. So anything that you could find in the Polity4 database, just to have a proxy of the political attitude at that time, but this didn't seem to have an effect. But yeah, we're still trying to see if we can find some sort of variations over time. I think the reassuring part, and the paper is long, and so at the end it looks a little bit, oh, we have done this, we have done that, and so on. The reassuring part was, if I look at preferences for redistributions from the European Social Survey, they are related to the introductions of the reform, control for other characteristics. So I think this reform did change the preferences for redistributions. And so in that sense, I can validate the index that way.
Thanks. Please lift your hands up if you have new questions. There was a question in the chat by Francesco Quintani saying that, is it possible that the relation between the immigrant share and political preference is actually non-monotonic, so that it may change over time? Do you have any way to pick up that or to know that?
This is an exercise that this would be my prior. So I think so Marco in his job market paper has very few data points on some cities, and he did find that there was a backlash and a reduction in preferences for redistribution. So it would be an interesting way of reconciling the past to the present if I had a long enough time series. So the immigrants arrive, initially I react to them. And so I lower my preferences for redistributions, and I start to, I interact with them. It was an interesting historical period, because after the Great Depressions, there was desire for the welfare state. And so it could be that over time, it can go from negative to positive. Yeah. Now, I always get these questions on external validity. So, on that, I don't know if we can, if I can have definite conclusions. Does it mean that if there is an immigrants group who arrived with very right-leaning beliefs, we will move the beliefs of people from the US to the right? Does the size matter? All these type of exercises, maybe for future research, other paper, but these are all interesting questions. This is a paper on preferences for redistribution, is a specific historical period of time. And the big change happened in a very important point with large mobilization. So it could be that if there wasn't these mobilizations, it was not enough to make the change. It could be that it's a general process. It could be that the size matters. So we can maybe play a bit with the nonlinearity effect. Do I need at least 20%, or is there an important size that determines the shift in ideology? But I think what Francesco is saying is plausible.
Okay. Next we have Gianluca Grimalda has a question.
Hello, thank you, Paola. Very interesting paper. The results are surprising, and especially because in many European countries, the welfare state was actually running well after the migration period you referred to. So Germany is probably the exception, the UK, of course, also. But for instance, in the Nordic countries, the welfare state really was started to be created in the 30s, and then, but actually was actually running after the Second World War. So I was wondering whether, rather than the year of reform, you were thinking of using the social spending, the amount of social expenditures in each individual countries, which is also a measure that Alberto Alesina used in his book as a proxy for redistributive preferences. And I also have another concern. So as far as I know, the literature in in political science trying to find a relationship between the type of welfare state and the preferences for redistribution has been unsuccessful. So, of course, the hypothesis was that the kind of welfare state should determine the preferences for redistribution of the citizens living in some countries rather than the other countries. But maybe you know better than me. But I think this literature in the political science has been unsuccessful. There has been a recent experimental paper by Almas et al. Finding a clear difference between Norway and the US, but this assumption that the type of welfare state that determines or has a stronger correlation with the preferences for a distribution of the citizens living in a country, I think we cannot take it for granted.
So let me give you, your questions has many pieces, so let's go one by one. So on the first one, yeah, it's true. Like if you look at the year of the introductions, most of the time variations come from the educational reforms and partially from the pension reforms, but then all the other type of reform were introduced later. And so, you know, we did the regressions only with the educational reform. Most of them were prior to the arrivals of the immigrants in the US for our historical period. We look for in the book of Alesina, there are measures of expenditure, but we didn't find historical at the country level over time for that period. But, you know, if you know of a source, I think that they are available as of today and maybe going back to 1970s, but I don't think we have data back in time. It would be another proxy. So again, I think there was a question of fiscal capacities, or all these measures on government that we have it for today. We didn't find them, but maybe we don't know the source. But if anyone in this audience has any reference, please let us know, and then we will be able to introduce them. Now, on the type of welfare states and preferences for redistributions, I think it could go both ways, in the sense that there is, at least in economics, and there is also a book on, so there is a paper by Galasso and co-authors that shows, they look at the European welfare states and they relate the type of welfare states to the type of family structures. And so depending on whether you have a nuclear versus extended family, this led over time to different type of welfare states and also different preferences for redistribution. So there is definitely a correlations. So your hypothesis is not contrary to our story, in the sense that if I take people from Sweden, they were exposed to the welfare states. Their preferences were different. They arrived with these preferences in the US. So what we are saying is that the preference of the welfare states in Europe, because they had more experience with it, was strong, had an impact for Americans rather than the welfare states at the time that was almost not existent. But I think people have looked at the correlations between the welfare states and preferences. What's come first, I think, depending on the literature that you read. The paper by Galasso and by Profeta and Galasso and Profeta was compelling, and so the family structure leading to the welfare state could be an interesting venue, for example.
Thank you very much, Paola. We were out of time. All this has been recorded for everybody and will be available on the CEPR website. Also, Paola, we will share with you all the chat that's in there. Okay. And there's some questions in there that I couldn't ask, including some by Ethan Kaplan, which I didn't ask. They're very elaborate. Okay. And thanks a lot, everybody. And we'll resume next month on June 2nd with Francesco Trebbi. Thank you very much, and see you in June.